It was supposed to be a day of freedom, a new beginning for millions of Black Americans. The Civil War had ended. The Confederate States had surrendered. And the 13th Amendment promised an end to the chains that had bound generations. Yet, for many, the reality of freedom was far more complicated. Imagine walking home after visiting family, the warm sun on your back, only to find that the law itself could imprison you for the simple act of being unemployed. This was the world Black Americans faced after emancipation, not a land of opportunity, but a landscape riddled with hidden traps designed to keep them in labor and subjugation. Even though slavery was technically abolished, new laws called Black Codes were passed across the South. These codes were not about justice or fairness, they were carefully crafted to criminalize everyday behaviors and create a new form of control. Vagrancy laws made it illegal to be unemployed, and seemingly minor infractions, walking along railroad tracks, carrying a simple tool, or playing dice, could land someone in chains. The system was designed to make freedom a prison, to turn the promise of liberty into a cycle of forced labor that was just as brutal as slavery itself. The stories of individuals trapped in this system are both heartbreaking and revealing. Young men like Green Cottonham in Alabama were arrested for vagrancy and sentenced to work in coal mines under conditions so harsh that survival was never guaranteed. Entire communities were affected, as the shadow of this new labor system loomed over families, breaking apart households and silencing voices that dared to dream of true freedom. It was a world where contracts, courts, and local authorities were manipulated to benefit the powerful, ensuring that Black Americans remained a cheap and expendable workforce for industries eager to rebuild the South. But these stories are not just echoes from the past, they are lessons about resilience, injustice, and the ongoing struggle for equality. Understanding this hidden history is crucial, because it reveals how systemic structures were created to exploit and suppress Black Americans, and how those structures evolved into policies and practices that continue to influence society today. In this video, we will uncover the hidden truths about post-Civil War America, exploring how freedom was promised but systematically denied, and how ordinary people navigated a world rigged against them. From the oppressive labor systems to the propaganda that reshaped public perception, we will journey through history that often goes untold in textbooks. If you want to uncover more untold stories, dive deep into history, and challenge what you thought you knew about freedom in America, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring these hidden histories to light, ensuring that stories of courage, resilience, and injustice are never forgotten. Stay with us, because what you are about to learn will change the way you see American history forever. As the shadow of so-called freedom stretched across the South, another, darker reality emerged, one that few Americans were willing to confront, and even fewer recorded in official histories. While the nation celebrated the end of slavery and the promises enshrined in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, a system of labor exploitation took root that would ensnare hundreds of thousands of Black Americans for decades to come. This was no longer the open brutality of antebellum slavery, where chains and whips were visible instruments of oppression. This was a more insidious form, one hidden behind contracts, legal technicalities, and the veneer of law and order. Yet, beneath that veneer lay a world as cruel, if not crueler, than the slavery that had supposedly ended. Corporations such as Steel and the Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company saw opportunity in the chaos left behind by emancipation. The South's economy had once relied entirely on enslaved labor, and now, with formal slavery abolished, these industries needed workers cheap, replaceable, and controlled. Convict leasing became their solution, a system in which Black Americans, often arrested on flimsy or fabricated charges such as vagrancy, gambling, or even carrying a tool deemed unnecessary, were sentenced to years of grueling labor. Once under contract, their lives became property in all but name. They were forced to work in coal mines deep underground, where darkness was permanent and air thick with coal dust, or in brick factories where the sun beat down mercilessly on their backs and children were chosen for tasks because their small hands could fit into the hottest kilns. The conditions were horrific by any measure. In Alabama's coal fields, it was not uncommon for 1 in 3 laborers to die each year. The companies viewed this not as a tragedy, but as a cost of doing business. Convicts were replaceable, and the demand for labor never ceased. Families were shattered, as men, women, and even children were swept into this industrial web, often never to return home. The corporations, some led by former Confederate officers, amassed immense wealth from this system, while the individuals providing the labor lived and died in obscurity, their suffering meticulously documented only in company ledgers and sparse government surveys. The lives of these laborers were governed not just by the companies themselves but by a legal and social apparatus designed to enforce compliance. Local officials, often plantation owners in their private life, acted as judges with the power to sentence, imprison, or transfer workers to the highest bidder. The law became a tool of exploitation, a mechanism to ensure that those who had once been enslaved could not escape economic subjugation, even as the Constitution ostensibly recognized their freedom. Contracts were drawn in complex legal language that few could read, and any attempt to question them could result in immediate incarceration. Every meal, every piece of clothing, every night's lodging was tallied against them, deepening their debt and extending their servitude indefinitely. It is crucial to understand that this system did more than exploit labor. It systematically reshaped society's perception of Black Americans. Newspapers, political discourse, and even emerging films reinforced stereotypes of Black people as inherently criminal or incapable of self-sufficiency. By the early 20th century, the myth of the Black Brute had replaced pre-Civil War narratives of loyal and hard-working laborers, serving the dual purpose of justifying economic exploitation and reinforcing social hierarchies. A man or woman who survived a day in a coal mine or a kiln was not celebrated. They were invisible, reduced to statistics, anecdotes in company reports. In some cases, names on tombstones buried in unmarked graves. Families who had briefly tasted freedom found themselves powerless against this network of corporations. Local authorities and legal frameworks. Letters home often went unanswered because the recipients were dead, relocated, or trapped in distant camps of labor. Children were torn from parents under the pretense of work assignments, and women faced not only the exhaustion of physical labor, but also the constant threat of abuse. The system's architects knew the human cost was extreme and accepted it without hesitation. For the profits outweighed empathy, and the law provided them cover. Yet, amidst this horror, moments of resistance flickered like fragile candles. Laborers would attempt escape, organize strikes, or find ways to communicate with loved ones. Small acts of defiance that revealed the unbroken spirit of those trapped in what was legally termed convict labor. These acts, however minor in the eyes of history books, demonstrated a refusal to accept that freedom could be so thoroughly denied. They remind us that the story of American labor after the Civil War is not simply one of victimization, but also one of endurance, courage, and the persistent demand for dignity in a society that often refused to grant it. By linking the industrial ambitions of corporations to the legal and social structures of the South, the story of convict leasing exposes a truth that has been largely erased from conventional narratives. Freedom alone, when unsupported by justice and opportunity, is fragile, and systems of exploitation can thrive under the guise of legality. Understanding this history is essential not only to recognize the suffering endured by Black Americans but also to comprehend how patterns of inequality, labor exploitation, and systemic oppression evolved into the modern era. As we explore these untold chapters of American history, it becomes clear that the industrial growth of the South and the fortunes of powerful corporations were built upon the backs of men, women, and children whose labor was coerced and whose humanity was systematically undermined. These stories demand acknowledgement and remembrance, for they are a testament to resilience in the face of oppression and a stark reminder of how freedom can be circumvented when law, profit, and prejudice intersect. By understanding these truths, we not only honor those who endured unimaginable hardship, but also gain a clearer lens through which to examine the enduring legacies of inequality that still shape our world today. As the shadow of convict leasing and forced labor stretched across the South, another insidious mechanism quietly took hold, one that entangled countless Black Americans in a web far more complex than the chains of slavery had ever been. Debt peonage, often referred to as debt servitude, was a system in which men, women, and even children could be legally bound to work for years, sometimes decades, simply to pay off fines, fees, or debts that were often inflated or entirely fabricated. It was a clever and cruel strategy, one that relied not on brute force alone, but on the manipulation of the legal system, social norms, and economic desperation, ensuring that freedom remained an illusion while labor remained at the disposal of those in power. In the earliest years following emancipation, the South's economy was in turmoil. Plantation owners and industrialists, many of whom had lost their enslaved workforce, sought ways to maintain control over black labor. The law, twisted to serve these interests, became a tool for extraction rather than protection. Vagrancy statutes, for instance, criminalized the very state of being unemployed, turning poverty itself into a punishable offense. A man walking to visit a sick relative or a woman carrying a basket of goods along a railroad track could suddenly find themselves accused of a crime, facing arrest, fines, and a court system that was anything but impartial. The justice system was often in collusion with those seeking cheap labor, as local officials, plantation owners, or even shopkeepers could act as judges, juries, and employers simultaneously. Once trapped in this cycle, escape was nearly impossible, and the law offered no safety net, only the promise of endless labor. The system of debt peonage was insidious because it created a labyrinth of obligations that could never realistically be paid off. Individuals were arrested, fined, and then offered the opportunity to work off their debts through contracts that were deliberately opaque, leaving them vulnerable to manipulation. Every day of labor, every meal, piece of clothing, and night's lodging was counted against the debt, often with interest rates or arbitrary fees that guaranteed the work would never truly repay the amount owed. Men who had been free for years could suddenly find themselves chained to a labor contract that stretched beyond their lifetime, their autonomy stripped away under the guise of legality. Children were not spared, as they were drafted into labor to satisfy debts incurred by parents or guardians, their youth and innocence exploited to maintain the flow of cheap labor that industries demanded. The human cost was devastating. Families were torn apart as parents were sent to distant farms, mines, or factories, leaving children vulnerable and communities fractured. Letters to loved ones often went unanswered, and the few attempts at resistance could result in brutal punishment. Many laborers suffered from exhaustion, disease, malnutrition, and abuse. Yet the system continued with the tacit approval of courts, local officials, and industrial leaders. This legal manipulation allowed the South to maintain the economic hierarchy of the antebellum period without violating the letter of the 13th Amendment, creating a shadow version of slavery that persisted for decades after the Civil War. The narrative of black criminality played a crucial role in sustaining debt peonage. Newspapers, political leaders, and even emerging entertainment industries propagated the idea that black Americans were inherently lazy, unruly, or dangerous, providing a social justification for their ensnarement in labor contracts. This propaganda, combined with corrupt local judicial systems, created an environment where society at large could ignore the exploitation, viewing it as punishment for supposed misbehavior rather than the result of deliberate economic and legal manipulation. The combination of systemic deception, economic exploitation, and racialized propaganda ensured that freedom remained fragile and illusory, and it ingrained a perception of black Americans as perpetually criminal or indebted that would persist long into the 20th century. The scale of debt peonage was staggering. Surveys from the late 19th and early 20th centuries reveal that hundreds of thousands of individuals were caught in this cycle, their labor fueling the growth of industries ranging from coal mining to brick production, timber harvesting, and agricultural work. Corporations profited immensely from this coerced labor, while families remained impoverished. Communities destabilized, and the promise of freedom remained an empty declaration. Every brick laid, every rail laid, every harvest gathered under this system was a testament to the unacknowledged toil of those trapped in a legal and economic nightmare. Yet, even in this darkness, stories of resilience and quiet resistance emerged. Laborers found ways to communicate, to organize, and to assert their dignity despite the overwhelming odds. Some attempted escape, others documented abuses in letters or journals, and entire communities maintained oral histories of survival and defiance, preserving knowledge that would eventually inform the broader struggle for civil rights. These acts, though often unrecorded in official histories, reveal that debt peonage, while brutal and systematic, was not unopposed. Understanding debt peonage is crucial not just as a historical fact, but as a lens through which to view the evolution of systemic racial and economic oppression in America. It exposes how freedom can be legally undermined, how labor can be exploited under the pretense of law, and how social narratives can reinforce economic control. By tracing the arc from Emancipation to the early 20th century, it becomes clear that the story of black labor in post-Civil War America is not one of simple liberation, but of continuous struggle against systems designed to maintain inequality, often under the guise of legality and social order. The legacy of debt peonage reminds us that freedom on paper is not always freedom in practice, and that the fight for justice and equity is an ongoing one. It calls for acknowledgement of the human suffering behind industrial growth, for recognition of resilience in the face of exploitation, and for a deep understanding of how legal and economic systems can perpetuate oppression, even when slavery has been abolished in name. By confronting these truths, we gain not only historical clarity but also insight into the forces that have shaped, and continue to shape, the lived experiences of black Americans. As the oppressive systems of convict leasing and debt peonage spread across the South, another layer of control emerged, one that blurred the lines between law, commerce, and outright exploitation. It was a world where local officials, often plantation owners or prominent businessmen, wielded extraordinary power as justices of the peace, judges whose authority was seldom questioned, and whose decisions could change the course of a person's life in an instant. These men, entrusted with the appearance of impartiality, instead became architects of a system that criminalized black existence itself, transforming the promise of freedom into a perilous trap where the slightest misstep, or sometimes no misstep at all, could result in imprisonment and forced labor for years. In towns and rural communities alike, everyday actions became criminalized through a complex web of local ordinances, state statutes, and black codes that were carefully designed to ensnare Black Americans. Walking along railroad tracks, carrying a tool necessary for work, or even speaking in a way deemed disrespectful could be enough to trigger an arrest. Often, these charges were fabricated entirely, or exaggerated to ensure conviction. Once arrested, the fate of the accused was largely predetermined, because the officials responsible for passing judgment were deeply invested in maintaining the labor system that enriched themselves and their associates. The courtroom, far from being a place of justice, became an instrument of economic and social control, where the scales of justice were tilted in favor of those who benefited from the coerced labor of others. The consequences were devastating and far-reaching. Men and women who had briefly experienced freedom found themselves swept back into servitude, their lives dictated by contracts they did not sign voluntarily, debts they could not repay, and laws designed to ensure compliance. Families were fractured as husbands, wives, and children were taken to distant work sites, often separated for years with little hope of reunion. The work itself was grueling, whether in coal mines, timber camps, brick kilns, or sugar fields, and the conditions were deliberately harsh to maximize output and discourage escape. The mortality rate in some labor camps was alarmingly high, a brutal reflection of how expendable these workers were considered by the very people who presided over their fate in court. This system was not merely a series of isolated incidents, but a carefully orchestrated network of power, law, and economic incentive. Plantation owners turned judges were able to wield the law as a tool to perpetuate the labor demands of industry while maintaining a facade of legality. A man who could barely read a contract or understand the complex legal language of the black codes would find himself ensnared, with no opportunity to appeal or seek representation. In many cases, the law itself was a weapon, bending morality to the desires of the powerful and ensuring that systemic exploitation could continue unchallenged for generations. The social ramifications were equally profound. Communities of Black Americans lived under constant threat, aware that a minor misstep or even the wrong perception by a local official could result in incarceration and forced labor. Fear permeated daily life, curtailing movement, suppressing speech, and undermining the pursuit of education or economic opportunity. Yet, despite these restrictions, acts of subtle resistance emerge, messages hidden in letters, clandestine gatherings to share information about unfair practices, and quiet defiance in work routines that asserted dignity in the face of relentless oppression. These acts, while small in the eyes of history, were powerful reminders of resilience and human determination in a system designed to strip both. The intertwining of legal authority and economic exploitation also reshaped public perception. Newspapers, often aligned with local power structures, echoed the narrative that Black Americans were inherently criminal or untrustworthy, a stereotype that justified both the legal system's harsh measures and the economic gains extracted from coerced labor. Over time, these narratives became embedded in society, reinforcing a hierarchy in which white officials, business owners, and judges maintained dominance while the labor and autonomy of black citizens were systematically suppressed. It was a manipulation not only of law but of perception, where social control was enforced as much by propaganda and fear as by contracts and chains. As the decades progressed, the scope of this exploitation expanded, reaching beyond the South and influencing industrial operations across the nation. Corporations, state agencies, and private individuals alike benefited from a labor force ensnared not through traditional slavery, but through a combination of legal coercion, debt, and social intimidation. Each arrest, each fine, and each contract signed under duress became a link in a chain that bound generations to servitude. It was a system so thoroughly embedded in the legal and economic fabric of the time that few could imagine challenging it successfully, and those who did faced immense personal risk. Yet, within this oppressive landscape, the human spirit persisted. Individuals sought education when possible, shared survival strategies, and nurtured community networks that offered support, however limited, against a system that was indifferent to their well-being. Their stories, often hidden from official records and rarely highlighted in textbooks, are critical for understanding the full scope of American history. They reveal not just the brutality of a legal and economic system designed to exploit, but also the courage, intelligence, and perseverance of those who navigated it with dignity intact. The tale of local officials acting as both enforcers of law and architects of exploitation illustrates the delicate but deliberate balance between power and oppression. It demonstrates how freedom can be systematically undermined through legal manipulation, and how ordinary people, entrusted with authority, can shape lives profoundly, sometimes for the better, but in this historical context, overwhelmingly for harm. By understanding this story, we gain insight into the roots of systemic inequality and the ways in which legal, social, and economic structures can perpetuate oppression even when the surface narrative proclaims liberation. It is a history that demands attention, reflection, and acknowledgement, not just for the suffering it records, but for the lessons it offers about vigilance, justice, and the resilience of the human spirit. As the systems of forced labor, debt peonage, and legal manipulation entrenched themselves across the South, another force quietly but powerfully cemented the social hierarchy that kept Black Americans oppressed: the media and emerging film industry. While the courts, corporations, and local officials ensured that labor remained cheap and controllable, newspapers, pamphlets, and films shaped the cultural narrative, influencing not just public perception but policy, policing, and the very understanding of what freedom meant. One of the most infamous examples of this was D.R. Griffith's 1915 film, Birth of a Nation, a work that did not merely entertain but actively promoted a deeply harmful ideology, portraying Black Americans as dangerous, morally corrupt, and inherently criminal, while glorifying white supremacist organizations like the Ku Klux Klan. The impact of such portrayals cannot be overstated, as they reinforce stereotypes, justified systemic oppression, and normalized violence against a population already constrained by law and economics. Before the Civil War, Northern whites had often perceived Black Americans as hardworking, loyal, and capable contributors to society, and even in the South, enslaved people were recognized for their skill and labor. Yet, as Reconstruction ended and systems like convict leasing and debt peonage expanded, these perceptions were deliberately inverted. Newspapers began to depict Black men as threatening figures, prone to criminality and vice. And films like Birth of a Nation translated these narratives into moving images that could reach millions. The movie depicted a post-Civil War South in which Black men, newly freed, were dangerous to white women and society itself, necessitating the intervention of the Klan as protectors. This distortion of reality served not only as entertainment but as propaganda, providing moral justification for the continuation of oppressive labor systems, harsh legal codes, and social restrictions. The timing of these cultural interventions was significant. By the early 20th century, the convict leasing and debt peonage systems had already ensnared hundreds of thousands of Black Americans. They were trapped in mines, fields, kilns, and factories, working long hours under brutal conditions, with mortality rates sometimes exceeding 30% per year. The public perception that Black people were naturally criminal or incapable of self-discipline, allowed white Americans to ignore or even condone this exploitation. The media provided the lens through which oppression became normalized, and stereotypes created a moral and social cover for what was, in essence, legalized slavery under another name. The influence of these portrayals extended far beyond the cinema. The narratives depicted in films and print media shaped law enforcement practices, judicial decisions, and community norms. Policemen and local officials often acted with impunity, targeting black citizens for minor infractions or fabricated crimes. Knowing that public opinion was already primed to view these individuals as dangerous, juries composed entirely of white citizens, often neighbors or local business owners, felt little compunction in convicting black defendants, reinforcing the cycle of labor exploitation and social subjugation. The myth of black criminality was thus not merely a story told on screen, it became a self-fulfilling prophecy, codified in law and enforced through violence and economic coercion. Furthermore, these cultural narratives affected education and the broader societal imagination. Textbooks, newspapers, and films presented a version of history in which Reconstruction was a period of black mismanagement and chaos, ignoring the profound achievements of black politicians, entrepreneurs, and community leaders during this era. Black Americans who had served in state legislatures, contributed to economic rebuilding, and advanced civil society were erased from the narrative, their successes obscured by tales of inherent criminality and moral failings. This selective memory reinforced the belief that social hierarchy was natural and justified, discouraging challenges to the labor systems and legal structures that exploited black workers. The psychological impact of these narratives was profound. Black communities lived under constant scrutiny and suspicion, knowing that their actions, speech, and even mere presence could be misinterpreted as threatening. Children grew up absorbing both the systemic barriers imposed by law and the cultural messages that suggested their inherent inferiority or moral weakness. These stories were internalized by the broader society, influencing generations' expectations, opportunities, and interactions, and they contributed to long-term social and economic disparities that persist in various forms today. Yet even within this oppressive environment, acts of resistance persisted. Black communities found ways to counter negative portrayals through newspapers, pamphlets, and oral histories, preserving a more accurate record of their lives, labor, and contributions. While films like Birth of a Nation sought to demonize, Black Americans created their own stories, shared in churches, schools, and community gatherings, asserting their humanity and challenging the false narratives imposed by dominant media. These acts were quiet but vital, planting seeds for the civil rights movements that would emerge decades later. Demanding recognition, equality, and justice. The story of media and film reinforcing the myth of black criminality highlights a crucial dimension of systemic oppression. That control is not only physical or legal but also cultural. By shaping public perception, media narratives legitimized exploitation, justified violence, and masked the humanity of those trapped in labor systems like convict, leasing, and debt peonage. Understanding this interplay between cultural representation and material oppression allows us to see the broader strategy behind maintaining racial hierarchies, a strategy that combined economic incentive, legal manipulation, and social conditioning into a coherent system of control. In examining this history, it becomes clear that the fight for justice and equality has always been multidimensional. Black Americans not only had to navigate brutal labor systems and biased courts, but also had to resist the psychological and social forces that sought to define them as inherently inferior. The legacy of media-driven myths reminds us that oppression often operates on multiple fronts simultaneously, and that challenging it requires both legal action and the reclamation of narrative. By acknowledging the role of films, newspapers, and other cultural tools in reinforcing systemic injustice, we gain a deeper understanding of the enduring struggles faced by Black communities and the resilience required to confront not just overt oppression, but the subtler forces that shape society's perceptions and expectations. By the turn of the 20th century, the South had transformed the aftermath of emancipation into a system that sustained economic dominance for corporations and former slave owners while ensuring that Black labor remained tightly controlled, coerced, and highly profitable. Convict leasing, debt peonage, and other forms of forced labor became the backbone of industrial and urban development across the region, turning human suffering into a foundation for economic expansion and modernization. Mines, brick kilns, railroads, timber camps, and plantations were not just sites of work, but theaters of exploitation where Black Americans were compelled to build the very infrastructure that would fuel the growth of the South and, by extension, the nation, all while remaining trapped in a system that denied them true freedom or compensation commensurate with their labor. The story begins in Alabama, Georgia, and across the southern states, where the immediate post-Civil War economy faced a paradox. The abolition of slavery had theoretically freed millions of Black Americans, yet the local economies that had relied on enslaved labor were still desperate for a workforce they could control. Enter the convict leasing system, a legal loophole that allowed corporations and former slave owners to lease prisoners from state governments for pennies on the dollar. In practice, these convicts, disproportionately Black men and women arrested under vagrancy laws or minor, fabricated charges, were subjected to working conditions as brutal, if not, than those endured under slavery. Corporations like Steel and Tennessee Coal did not hesitate to exploit this labor, sending men into coal mines where the death rate could reach 30% per year, or requiring laborers in brick factories and timber yards to endure backbreaking toil under scorching heat and minimal sustenance. The economic incentives for corporations and former slave owners were enormous. Every mine excavated, every brick fired, and every rail laid added not only to the industrial output of the South, but also to the personal wealth of those who had formerly depended on slave labor. In Georgia, convicts produced hundreds of thousands of bricks annually, literally rebuilding cities like Atlanta after the destruction of the Civil War. In Alabama, coal mines worked by leased convicts fueled the steel industry, powering the furnaces that would drive industrial growth nationwide. Plantation owners, many of whom had lost their enslaved workforce, became intermediaries and overseers in these labor systems, ensuring that the human cost was externalized while profits flowed directly into their pockets. Every death, every injury, and every broken body was absorbed as a cost of doing business, a grim calculus that underscored the disposable nature of the workforce. Beyond the immediate economic impact, convict labor served to preserve the social hierarchy of the antebellum South. By controlling the labor of Black Americans through incarceration and legal manipulation, corporations and local officials maintained a racialized labor force while creating a narrative of criminality that justified these practices to the broader public. Black men and women who had briefly tasted freedom during Reconstruction found themselves once again subjected to a system of surveillance, punishment, and coerced labor, a cruel cycle in which personal agency was subordinated to economic exploitation. The interlocking structures of law, industry, and social control ensured that the system was self-perpetuating. Arrests under minor charges fed labor contracts. Labor contracts produced profit, and profits reinforced the social and political power of those at the top. The human dimension of this exploitation was profound. Families were separated, communities disrupted, and lives shortened under conditions that offered neither safety nor dignity. Children were drafted into work alongside adults, their bodies and energy leveraged to maximize output in mines, fields, and kilns. Survivors recount working from dawn until dusk, barely fed, poorly clothed, and subjected to brutal punishments if they failed to meet the impossible demands of their overseers. The threat of violence, both physical and legal, hung over every action, ensuring compliance through fear as much as through formal contracts. Every day became a testament to endurance and survival, a struggle against forces far more powerful than the individual could ever hope to confront alone. The broader societal impact of convict labor extended into the realms of politics, culture, and perception. Local and national media often echoed the narrative of black criminality, portraying convicts as inherently dangerous or morally deficient, reinforcing white supremacist ideologies that justified the systemic exploitation. Films, newspapers, and pamphlets collaborated with economic and legal structures to maintain the perception that this labor system was not only necessary but deserved, ensuring that the exploitation was normalized and rarely questioned by those who did not experience it firsthand. This alignment of economic incentive, legal authority, and cultural messaging created a formidable barrier to reform, one that persisted for decades despite the ostensible abolition of slavery. Yet, even in the face of relentless oppression, stories of resilience emerged. Convict laborers found ways to communicate, to resist, and to maintain dignity, whether through clandestine gatherings, preserving oral histories, or quietly asserting autonomy in the minutiae of daily work. These acts, though often unrecorded in official histories, speak to the human capacity to endure, to assert identity, and to preserve community in the harshest of circumstances. By the early 20th century, the impact of convict labor on the Southern economy was unmistakable. Urban centers, industrial facilities, and transportation networks had been built and expanded on the backs of black laborers whose freedom had been systematically constrained through legal and economic means. Corporations and former slave owners reaped enormous profits, consolidating wealth and power, while the human cost remained invisible to much of the nation. Understanding this history provides critical context for both the economic development of the South and the enduring racial and social inequalities that trace their roots to this era. The legacy of convict labor reminds us that industrial and urban growth in the South was not a story of progress alone, but one intertwined with coercion, exploitation, and racialized power. The cities, railways, and factories that stand today as symbols of development were built through labor that was forcibly extracted, often at the expense of life, health, and human dignity. By confronting this history, we recognize the complex interplay between freedom and exploitation, wealth and oppression, and we gain insight into the long shadows cast by these systems on the lives of Black Americans for generations to come. The story of slavery in America is often told as if it ended definitively with the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 or the ratification of the 13th Amendment in 1865. Yet the grim reality is far more complex, as the life of Alfred Irving starkly illustrates. Born into a world shaped by the aftershocks of the Civil War and Reconstruction, Alfred became one of the last known individuals to live as a legally recognized slave, not in the distant past of the 19th century, but in a time that was well within modern memory. His experience exposes the uncomfortable truth that slavery in the United States did not conclude neatly at the end of the Civil War, but rather persisted through decades of legal manipulation, systemic coercion, and social complicity, stretching into the middle of the 20th century and leaving scars that are still felt today. Alfred Irving's captivity began when he fell under the control of the Scrobar Bark family on a farm outside Beeville, Texas. He was not an indentured servant, nor a convict laborer, nor a victim of debt peonage. He was, in every practical sense, a slave. For at least 4 years, he was subjected to the most brutal conditions imaginable, beaten with chains, whips, and ropes, starved, and forced to labor tirelessly under the constant threat of further punishment. His captors treated him not as a human being but as property, a commodity whose suffering could be exploited with impunity. Unlike earlier systems of forced labor, where economic incentives sometimes encouraged minimal care to preserve the workforce, Alfred's life was expendable. His torment was a matter of convenience and control, illustrating the sheer cruelty and audacity of those who continued to operate within a framework that effectively ignored the moral and legal prohibitions against slavery. What makes Alfred Irving's story particularly striking is its placement in historical context. By 1942, the United States was deeply embroiled in World War II, a global conflict fought under banners of freedom, democracy, and human rights. Abroad, American leaders criticized the oppression of civilians under fascist regimes. Yet on domestic soil, a man remained enslaved in the shadows of a nation that claimed moral superiority. Alfred's liberation was not the result of grassroots activism or public outcry alone, but a consequence of federal investigation and legal intervention prompted in part by the broader geopolitical stakes of the era. The Roosevelt administration recognized that unchecked systems of forced labor and peonage undermined the country's credibility on the world stage, and this realization led to a decisive, if belated, effort to confront and dismantle one of the final vestiges of legalized slavery. Alfred's release marked the symbolic and literal end of a continuity of oppression that had persisted since the Civil War. It underscored the failure of post-bellum policies to secure freedom in practice for all Black Americans and highlighted the persistence of systems, whether through convict leasing, debt peonage, or exploitative labor arrangements that had functioned to subvert emancipation for decades. While Reconstruction had initially offered promise, with Black Americans participating in politics, education, and economic life, the retreat of federal oversight and the rise of Jim Crow, coupled with the complicity of corporations and local officials, created an environment in which slavery, in one form or another, continued unabated. Alfred Irving's experience also illuminates the intersections of law, economy, and race in the United States. His captivity occurred under a legal system that allowed such exploitation to flourish, relying on ambiguous definitions of crime and labor, and on officials who either ignored or actively facilitated abuses. These systems were buttressed by societal narratives that portrayed Black Americans as inherently criminal, morally suspect, or naturally suited for subjugation. Narratives perpetuated through media, propaganda, and cultural expression, the combination of economic incentive, legal loopholes, and social acceptance meant that the machinery of oppression could operate with near total impunity, ensuring that Alfred and countless others remained trapped for decades beyond the official end of slavery. Moreover, Alfred's liberation occurred in an era when the broader Black population was still grappling with segregation, disenfranchisement, and systemic inequality. Schools, public spaces, and voting rights remained restricted, and the cycle of economic and social disadvantage continued. The fact that a man could be enslaved in 1942 reveals not only the endurance of legal and economic exploitation but also the slow pace of societal reckoning with the legacy of slavery. It challenges common narratives that position emancipation as an instantaneous or universally experienced event, demonstrating that freedom was not a singular moment but a contested, uneven, and ongoing process. fought for in courts, communities, and individual lives over decades. Alfred Irving's story serves as a stark reminder that history is not always neatly categorized, and that the moral arc of a nation is often uneven, marked by triumphs shadowed by injustices that linger far longer than textbooks might suggest. His eventual freedom was the culmination of legal action, societal pressure, and historical circumstance. Yet it also signals the importance of remembering those whose suffering remained invisible for so long. The existence of a legally recognized slave in the 20th century forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the resilience of oppressive systems and the human cost of their maintenance. Reflecting on Alfred's life encourages a broader understanding of the continuum of racial oppression in the United States. From slavery to convict leasing, from debt peonage to segregation, and even to modern systemic inequities, the patterns of control, exploitation, and dehumanization have evolved while maintaining a disturbing consistency in their impact on Black communities. Alfred Irving's freedom in 1942 is both a testament to human resilience and a cautionary tale about the fragility of liberty when legal and social systems are manipulated to perpetuate oppression. It challenges us to examine not only the historical events themselves but the long shadows they cast, shaping societies, economies, and communities in ways that remain profoundly relevant today. As we reflect on the centuries-long struggle for freedom and justice in the United States, it becomes clear that the story of slavery did not simply end with the ratification of the 13th Amendment or the liberation of Alfred Irving in 1942. Instead, what we witness is a continuum of systemic oppression, evolving through legal, economic, and social structures designed to control and marginalize Black Americans. The historical patterns established during slavery and perpetuated through post-Civil War systems of convict leasing, debt peonage, and Black codes laid the groundwork for modern policies that continue to disproportionately impact Black communities, ensuring that the shadow of forced labor and racialized oppression stretches into the present day. The war on drugs, launched in the late 20th century, serves as a stark example of how policy can be used to enforce racial hierarchies under the guise of law and order. As Nixon's domestic policy chief openly admitted, the administration intentionally targeted Black communities, criminalizing behaviors and deploying enforcement measures that devastated families and communities while reinforcing stereotypes of criminality. What had once been overt systems of coercion chains, forced labor, and legal loopholes to maintain a subservient workforce transformed into subtler, yet no less effective, methods of social control. Mass incarceration, unequal sentencing, and over-policing became the modern mechanisms of a system that, at its continued to extract labor, obedience, and social compliance from Black Americans. These practices are not isolated incidents but the cumulative result of centuries of structural inequality. Schools underfunded in predominantly Black neighborhoods, housing policies that segregated and impoverished communities, employment discrimination, and disparities in healthcare all echo the economic and social manipulation that began during Reconstruction and the convict leasing era. The persistent myth of Black criminality, once reinforced by media and propaganda like the film Birth of a Nation, continues to shape public perception and policy, influencing how laws are enforced and how resources are distributed. The historical narrative that portrayed Black Americans as dangerous or unworthy of trust did more than harm reputations. It justified practices that kept generations in cycles of poverty. Incarceration and disenfranchisement. Understanding this continuum helps illuminate why, even today, racial disparities in the criminal justice system are so pronounced. Arrest rates, sentencing severity, and prison populations disproportionately affect Black Americans, reflecting centuries of codified oppression that adapted to maintain control even as overt slavery was abolished. Policies like mandatory minimum sentences, stop and frisk practices, and inequitable bail systems are, in essence, descendants of the black codes and vagrancy laws that once funneled freedmen into forced labor. The machinery may have changed, but the impact on communities remains deeply rooted and generational. Yet, the story is not only one of suffering, it is also a testament to resilience, resistance, and the unyielding pursuit of justice, despite legal manipulation, systemic barriers, and the constant threat of violence. Black Americans have forged communities, advocated for civil rights, and challenged oppression through every available channel. The civil rights movement of the 1960s, culminating in landmark legislation such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, represented the culmination of decades of struggle against entrenched systems of inequality, offering both symbolic and practical victories. However, even as progress was made, new forms of systemic oppression emerged, requiring continued vigilance, advocacy, and reform. Recognizing the historical roots of these modern injustices is essential to creating meaningful change. The legacy of forced labor and racialized oppression is not merely a historical footnote. It informs the structures, attitudes, and policies that shape contemporary society. By studying cases like Alfred Irving's, understanding the economic exploitation through convict labor, and tracing the evolution of legal mechanisms from black codes to the war on drugs, we gain critical insight into how inequality is reproduced and perpetuated. Awareness is the first step toward action. Reforming policies, addressing systemic biases, and fostering equitable opportunities for all communities requires confronting these uncomfortable truths with honesty and urgency. As we conclude this reflection, it is important to remember that history is not a distant story, but a living narrative that continues to influence the world around us. The fight against oppression, exploitation, and systemic inequality is ongoing, and each of us plays a role in shaping a society where freedom, justice, and dignity are truly universal. The courage, resilience, and perseverance of those who endured centuries of oppression should inspire us to challenge inequities wherever they exist, to advocate for fairness in our laws and institutions, and to ensure that the cycles of exploitation that have haunted generations do not continue unchecked. Thank you for watching and taking the time to engage with this critical history. If you found this video illuminating and want to help spread awareness of these untold stories, please make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with others who care about justice, equality, and historical truth. By staying informed and engaged, we honor the struggles of the past and contribute to a more equitable future, ensuring that the lessons of history guide us toward lasting change.